Oh, hey, didn't see you there. Just laying in a bed of moss. Welcome to your lesson on bryophytes.
Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about bryophytes. What are bryophytes? Bryophytes is the scientific name for moss. Now, you might think, moss is so small, why would we even want to learn about it? It may be small, but it is super mighty. Moss is one of those plants that really can and has shaped the world. So let's dive in together. The moss, well, let's talk about what moss even looks like, right? I would assume we all have seen moss, but you never know. So this is what moss looks like most of the time. Now there are about 14,000 different species, known species or named species of moss. That's a lot of moss. I think there's something like just a little over 2,000 kinds of birds. So to put that in perspective, there's a lot of mosses out there. And one of the interesting things is when you see a little, chunk of moss, most of the time you're not just seeing one, you're seeing mosses. There's probably at least 2 different kinds of mosses just in this little chunk. Now, the places that you're going to find mosses are going to be any kind of surface. So mosses are always small. They're extremely little, and we'll get into kind of their makeup and how they grow and how they live and everything and why they're so little in just a little bit, but you're going to find them on any surface. Now, what do I mean when I say surfaces? Things like the ground, a rock, a tree, the side of a building. If you leave a soccer ball out long enough in a moist environment, maybe you'll have some moss. You never know. So really anything that is a surface. Now, they grow there for a couple of different reasons. One of the reasons is that they like this, what is called the boundary layer. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. And they also like to stay moist, kind of warm, not hot, and they don't want to get dry. And that's all in this boundary layer on things. Again, we'll get to that after we talk about kind of their makeup. So I've got 2 really quick, before we dive into that, little samples of mosses that I just found. One was on a little patch of grass, and the other was climbing up a redwood tree. Now, sometimes you'll see mosses in soil, like on the ground in soil, but they are quite different than other plants, and they often get out-competed. And that means other plants are better at growing bigger, taller, and taking over the root systems than little bryophytes are. So a lot of the times you're going to see them on places that plants can't grow. Like plants generally don't grow in the bark of a redwood tree. Plants generally don't grow on rocks. But bryophytes are like, well, there's no competition here. I'll just hop in here, and this is where I'm going to grow. So, all right, so let's talk about the structure of a bryophyte or of a moss. So not all plants, most plants have roots, have a big root system, right? If you were to pull up a piece of grass, you'd see a fibrous root system. If you were to pull up an entire redwood tree, you'd see a massive root system. The root system goes deep into the ground, or, relatively deep into the ground. It does a couple of things for plants. It sucks up water and nutrients from the soil. It holds the plant stable in the ground. Imagine if you just took a massive redwood without any roots and just stuck it in the ground. You know what would happen? The first earthquake or the first big windstorm? Right? The roots hold it in place so that you don't have that tree falling over. Well, bryophytes don't have roots. They don't have root systems. They have these little fibers called rhizoids that help them stick to the surfaces. Now, they're similar to roots in that they kind of come out the bottom and they hold the moss to something, but they don't pull up nutrients. So they're different than real roots. So they're not roots. So they're plants, but they don't have roots. Another interesting thing about bryophytes is that they do photosynthesize, just like plants, but in a kind of a slightly different way. So the normal plants will take in light from the sun. Bryophytes will take in light from the sun. They'll use water from their roots. Well, bryophytes don't have roots, and they'll take in carbon dioxide, which is what we breathe out and what animals breathe out. Bryophytes will do the same, and they turn that into usable energy for the plant to grow, and they'll turn it into oxygen, which is what we breathe in. So if bryophytes don't have roots to get the nutrients and get the water that's necessary for that process, how are they getting it? The really cool thing about bryophytes is they can actually synthesize or get it from the air. Bryophytes can get water from the air. Now, I'm not super well versed in exactly how they do this, the exact scientific process, but isn't that amazing? They can pull in, any form of humidity in the air, and especially in that boundary layer, which we will get to. But that boundary layer, there's going to be a lot of humidity there. It's kind of like a mini greenhouse. And they can take the water from the air, and they can take any kind of floating nutrients from that too, or from the water, nutrients in the water, and grow and photosynthesize that way. So another really cool thing about bryophytes is that they're believed to be the first plants to colonize land. So we've got plants in the water, algae and kelps and sea grasses and such, but those plants need water, need to be in water to survive. Now, millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of years ago, before there were trees on land, before there were people on land, way before that, before there were any kind of weird looking animals on land, there were mosses that colonized the land, which is so cool. So they're these super, super old beings, but also not super primitive, which is a word that scientists use to sometimes mean, primitive meaning not very advanced. They can't do any really interesting things. So while they are primitive in their age, they're quite advanced in how they interact with their environment. One of the really interesting things too is that they're found on all 7 continents. So you'll find them in the deserts, you'll find them in the rainforests, you'll find them in Antarctica, right? In cold places, warm places, really hot places, right? And really wet places. Now, moss need water to survive, right? They get their nutrients, they get their water from the air. So a lot of them, most of them you'll find will be in places that are generally a little bit wetter, a little bit more moist. But sometimes, and this is why they're not super primitive, they can also be this really advanced creature. They can live in places like deserts. Well, the definition of a desert is a place where it doesn't rain a lot. So it barely rains in deserts. Well, how, the air is dry. How are they pulling out any oxygen or any water from that air? Well, one of the really cool things is when the sun goes down in the desert and it's all cold, it actually gets quite cold in deserts at night. It's dark. Sometimes the other plants around the mosses will start doing a different kind of photosynthesis than other plants. And I'm not going to get into that because that's a whole other really interesting topic / whole interesting video that maybe we'll cover later. But in doing their photosynthesis, they do transpiration, which is like breathing, but there's water that comes out. So if you've ever gone up to a window when it's cold out and breathed on it, and then you can see little water droplets, Because when we breathe out, there's water that comes out. So the plants are all breathing all this water coming out that they've all stored, right? Succulents and cactuses store the water, but when they breathe, when they do photosynthesis, water's coming out. The mosses around them go, oh, party, it's a water party, and they gather all that water. And then during the day, it's so hot, and they've totally dried out, and sometimes they look black and charred, like they've been set on fire, and they were like, you're certainly dead. But they're not. They're alive still. How incredible is that? That they've gone from this, this is green, they've gone from this green goodness at night to then during the day, they just shrivel up. It's almost like they're dead. And then at night, they just expand again. Mosses. So incredible.